Hey there, guys. Thanks for dropping by and welcome to another Holy Shed, which is right here at the bottom of our garden with rain lashing down outside at the moment and the sound of a lone robin singing its heart out, come what may. Now, we've just returned from a fabulous weekend away at the Amadown Centre in Somerset with, I think it was 27 people, lovely people who came together to enjoy each other's company, to enjoy the surroundings, and I guess to listen to me yakking on about a big enough God for an emerging world. We had a lot of fun. I mean, we had depressing reminders of what's going on, what it's like out there in the world, but we also focused on hope, a defiant hope that is committed to facing up to the darkness of our world with light in our eyes, with hope in our hearts, and with imagination in our minds that, can help to create a different kind of future. There's something marvelous about being together for a few days or for a weekend, focusing on stuff that we really care about. And I hope if you haven't been to one of these kind of weekends, that you'll be able to do so at some point in the future. Anyway, all I'm saying is, if I fall asleep halfway through this shed, you should know why, and maybe just chat among yourselves, if that's okay. Today, I want to amplify something I talked about last time because a couple of people contacted me and asked if I would. It's the bit where I mentioned that I don't really, well, I don't at all accept the traditional idea of an original sin, which, as the story goes, or as we've been taught it, we all inherit from Eve's disobedience in the Garden of Eden when she ate the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, persuaded Adam to join her, and hey presto, that's why the world is as it is. That's why there is such a thing as sin and evil in the world. And for in exchange for all of this, if we do not repent and accept Jesus into our hearts, we will spend eternity in hell, suffering as a result of something that happened back then. Anyway, no, I don't believe that. You can read more about my interpretation of the story in Genesis 3 in my book Black Sheep and Prodigals. But in brief, I see that story in Genesis 3 as, properly speaking, a myth, a kind of poem, maybe even a riddle, which is much more about the birth or the evolution of moral consciousness and moral responsibility than about original sin. I mean, think about it. The paradise, as I was taught that it was, that they lived in before Eve ate of the fruit of that tree, was a state of innocence in which they were amoral because they had no knowledge of good and evil. So it was an amoral sort of condition, which I would call subhuman in the sense that we understand humanity today. Science does tell us a similar story of that evolution through the evolution of the brain from its reptilian instincts to emotional intelligence through to moral awareness and responsibility. But that's another thing. But it's interesting that that's there. I believe that within the parameters of the story of Genesis, the Genesis myth, the first couple actually had to eat of that tree. It just had to happen in order that they and their successors would evolve and become moral beings. And Eve, therefore, was the one with the courage to step up. I think there's so much subtlety and eye twinkling in the brilliant storytelling of Genesis, which is mostly bypassed, and instead the story is reduced to a didactical narrative that fits in with a later doctrinal framework of sin and redemption and so on that's imposed back upon it. It's certainly not how Jewish people interpret that story, because the terms sin and fall do not appear anywhere in the narrative, okay? And certainly in Hebrew tradition from which the story arose, there's no concept of a fall, no concept of original sin. In that tradition, sin is the product of individual choices, not something that's inherited like some, burden and some guilt stain that is passed down from generation to generation. That's an interpretation, a later Christian interpretation that's put upon the story. It's not what the story itself is telling us. Anyway, enough of that for now. What I said last time is that if there is something you could call an original sin in the Bible, it's not there in Genesis 3. It's much more legitimately present in the following chapter, in Genesis 4, in an act of violence and murder. And bear in mind, it's in this text in Genesis 4 that the word sin first appears in the Bible, not earlier. But let's just step back a little for a moment. Genesis means beginnings, right? This is a book of beginnings, not in a historical sense, but in a spiritual, psychological, societal, poetic sense. And also, the Bible didn't just kind of appear, it didn't just emerge in a vacuum. It's something, the writers and these stories arose in a whole flourishing culture of myths, stories, psalms, and poetry in the ancient Near East, in places like Mesopotamia, Sumer, and Babylon. And the stories in the first 11 chapters of Genesis in particular are mythical stories which are reworkings of existing myths in ancient Near Eastern culture, which are modified to express and explore the peculiarities of Hebrew theological and religious reflection. You don't tend to hear that in sermons, but trust me, it's a fact. So biblical stories like the creation, the birth of humans, the great flood, or the story of a tower being built that would reach toward heaven, all of these stories have earlier versions in the culture of that region. There are Mesopotamian stories of the flood, including a Noah figure, which existed hundreds of years before the biblical stories. Yeah? These stories were like in the air. They were in the air that the Hebrew writers and storytellers breathed, just as we have stories that are part of the ether in our own age. So today, looking at the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis 4, it's really a story that echoes the Sumerian myth, Sumerian from Sumer, Sumerian myth of the god Dumezid and Enkidu. And it's called, in that context, the dispute between the shepherd god and the farmer god. And in the Sumerian drama, Utu, the sun god, advises his sister Inanna, the goddess of love and fertility. I'll ask you questions about this in a minute. Utu advises his sister Inanna to marry Dumezid, the shepherd, but Inanna actually fancies the farmer, Enkidu, instead. It's all very soap opera, really. You know how these things go, how this story goes, don't you? I mean, the suitors scrap. Dumezid asks what the farmer has got that he doesn't have. That man of dikes and canals, he says. And Enkidu argues back, and Dumezid tries to escalate the quarrel. But the farmer resists. Why should I fight against you, shepherd, he says. Let your sheep eat the grass of the riverbank. Let your flock graze on my stubble. Finally, Dumezid does indeed get the girl. Inanna chooses the shepherd, though Enkidu is invited to the wedding. So it's kind of a bit of a better outcome than the Cain and Abel story. But it's basically, the account that Cain and Abel is based on. In the Bible, Cain and his younger brother Abel offer to God their twin Neolithic domestications of grain and sheep. And as the story goes, God preferred Abel's to his older sibling Cain's offering, which seems pretty damned unfair to me. However, choosing the younger over the elder is the typical preference of the biblical God in what I think you could see as a countercultural challenge to a patriarchal world where the firstborn son is always the heir. But you know what? The psychology of God is not what is at stake here. You know, it's not about that. It's myth, it's story, not fact. Okay? The basic point is, as you might put it, shit happens, and it's what you do about it that matters. That's kind of at the heart of the story. Genesis uses an existing ancient Near Eastern myth to dig into the origin of sin and malice. And right there is an important point. This story contains the earliest mention of sin in the Bible, not in the Garden of Eden, not to do with apples or pears or a snake or sex, you know, the church's eternal preoccupation. No, it's about a conflict between two brothers. This is the original sin, if you want to use that language, which I don't particularly, but it helps here to put it that way. So look, set aside the weirdness of God choosing one sacrifice over the other, which I think is a device in the story to say that sometimes life is unfair. But that's not the point. The point is how we deal with the unfairness of life. I think that's really very much at the nub of this story. So Cain and Abel argue. Rabbi Harold Kushner, who wrote the book Why Bad Things Happen to Good People, he writes wonderfully about this and about it being the old sibling rivalry about who the parents love most. And the original sin that affects virtually everyone, he says, is not disobedience, not lust, but the belief that there's not enough love to go around. And therefore, someone else is loved more. And that's a theme that runs right through Genesis, through the stories in Genesis, because it is actually a very primal source of conflict and trouble. But whatever the row was about, before it happened, God told Cain this. He said, whether you offer well or whether you don't, referring to the sacrifice, whether you offer well or whether you don't, sin is crouching at the door. That's the first mention of sin in the Bible. Sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, and you must master it. That's really interesting, isn't it? That's the first statement about sin, first statement of God about sin in the Bible. Whether you offer well or whether you don't, the fact is sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, and you must master it. So hey, in the earliest portrayal of sin, it's not seen as some internal and irresistible force or an existential stain on the soul of every human being or on Cain in particular. No, instead, it is likened by God to an external feral feline crouching to attack when we least expect it. Furthermore, Cain can and should conquer sin, it says, just like any other wild beast that might attack him. But anger does, in fact, in the story, get the better of him, and he murders his brother Abel. That was the sin that was crouching at the door. To me, this is a different, much more helpful understanding of sin, not something inherited, not something that is inevitable, but we have choices. We can make better choices. And isn't that how we see real life anyway? So it's interesting, guys. That is how sin is first portrayed in the Bible and spoken of. Something which is to do with choice and the option to make better choices. Where's your brother? God asks. No idea, Cain replies. Am I my brother's keeper? What have you done? God says. Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground, and now you will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. So Cain undergoes an evolutionary throwback from farmer to hunter-gatherer. You know, there's a retrograde step here, not as divine punishment, but as a consequence. As a consequence of his human choice, he's thrown back, which is why I often say in the Holy Shed, stay human. Because every day, guys, every day we make choices which confirm and enhance our moral and spiritual evolution as human beings, or which throw us back on earlier reptilian instincts, which we see all the time in the world. Yeah, like right now in present day events, we see it again and again and again. So much conflict in the world. It results from this kind of sinking back into more reptilian instincts than the, emotional and spiritual intellect to be able to make proper choices based on moral judgments. But the story goes on. Realizing the consequences of following these primal instincts, violence begets violence for the first time. Cain experiences fear as a result of that. Anyone who meets me will kill me, he says. Not so, God replies. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance. Now, I always thought that this meant that God would get them, kill 7 more. But no, that would mean that Cain had trapped God into escalating violence, which I, for one, can't believe is true. I can't believe in a violent God. And notice what happens next. It says Cain knew his wife, in the biblical sense, that is, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And Cain built a city which he called Enoch. This is the first biblical mention of the dawn of civilization. Cain built a city. He built a city with walls. And this is the point why originally, was a city built in this, mythical biblical narrative. It was as a form of protection, a place to belong, a place to hide, a place of safety for himself and his family. And it's here in the new world of civilization that Lamech, one of Cain's descendants, boasts to his 2 wives that he'd killed a man for wounding him, a young man, it says, for striking him. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, Lamech brags, truly for Lamech it will be 77-fold. I'll multiply the revenge. Wow. So, this is the really big story here, isn't it? That out of that violent act by Cain on his brother, there's this escalation of violence and a civilization that's being created on the basis of violence as a way of building some sense of protection. But revenge is this instinct that is now there because violence begets violence. That's the fact. The story of Cain and Abel isn't just about an original fratricide, it's about escalatory violence, almost as a seductive inevitability. But it presents a God who avows that it is not an inevitability, that this pattern could be overcome. The original sin in the Bible is violence, and more than that, escalatory violence, and cities, civilization, is where that escalation mostly occurs. But it's not inevitable. You must overcome it, God says. Over to you. The choice is yours. John Dominic Crossan, the New Testament scholar, points out that we humans are not natural-born killers. If we were, he says, why would we suffer from post-traumatic stress after a battle? because it's all wrong. It's against something fundamental to our natures to go around committing violence and killing people. And when we do kill people, or when we do end up in violence, there's a consequence, there's a kickback within ourselves. The mark of Cain is on human civilization, not on human nature. And escalatory violence is our nemesis, not our inevitability. Our avoidable decision, not our inescapable destiny. It's our original sin, but we can do something about it. Stay human. Does Jesus have this story in mind? I wonder, when he says, forgive your brother 70 times 7. Forgiveness, peace, and reconciliation are the way out of the cycle of violence, which can just be passed on from one generation to the next. In his classic book, The Power of Myth, Joseph Campbell says, a myth is something that has never happened, but is happening all the time. That's a very good definition of a myth. A myth is something that's never happened, but is happening all the time, which is why the rabbis have engaged in midrash, searching these strange ancient texts. They explored what makes people so angry that they lose control and are driven to destroy what they love, and in the process destroy themselves. Rabbi Sandy Eisenberg Sasso, big name, lovely woman, she writes beautiful Bible storybooks for children, which I massively recommend. If you've got kids or grandkids, check out Sandy Eisenberg Sasso's Bible storybooks. Each one is an exercise in modern midrash, biblical interpretation. And in her book, Cain and Abel, Finding the Fruits of Peace, she envisages brothers who loved each other, but one day argued about whether it was better to be a farmer or a shepherd. This is a children's story. Cain insisted that God loved the farmer the best. After all, God planted the first garden, he said. Abel argued that God loved the shepherd best. After all, God created the animals and watches over them, he insisted. Cain and Abel prayed to God. When Cain prayed, he brought with him a large basket of ripened vegetables. When Abel prayed, he brought the finest sheep. And Cain looked at his silent vegetables shriveled up in the noonday sun, whilst Abel's sheep bleated happily in the field. Cain was certain that God must like sheep better than vegetables. And, maybe God did indeed like the shepherd better than the farmer. The Sandy Sasso's children's midrash internalizes the story beautifully for a child audience, internalizes the story. Divine rejection is something in Cain's head. It's a story that never happened, but happens all the time. Yeah? Internal fears and anxieties are projected onto the outside world, resulting in anger and bullying, or paranoia and nervous breakdown, in conflict and war, or fearful withdrawal and depression. Unresolved anger has consequences. But as God told Cain right back there in that original story, there's a different way. There's a different way. Rabbi Jesus took a similar approach in the Sermon on the Mount, internalizing the issues. It's not just the act of murder, he says. It's the anger you feel first that you need to deal with. That is the sin crouching at the door. That's where, you need to take control right there at that point before it gives birth to violence. To me, the myth of Cain and Abel is a story of innocence lost through pointless argument and a mistaken sense of rejection, escalating to anger and violence, to conflict and war. Sandy Sasso tells her children in the storybook, this is what she writes: Time passed, a long time. The world was not new anymore. People built cities and made homes there. Yet people often spoke angry words, and with angry words they drew their swords. Swords turned to guns and guns to bombs. One killing became two, two became four, and four became 16. 16 killings became war. Entire worlds were destroyed. Perhaps one day, she says, when each person learns to reach out an open hand without the rock, without the sword, without the gun, then the entire world could be saved. I mean, excuse me, but bloody hell. That's the kind of Sunday school story I want our kids and our grandkids to hear. Don't you? Violence is our original sin, our constantly besetting sin. Physical violence, verbal violence like we see all over social media, emotional violence expressed in manipulation, coercion, abuse, and emotional control. Paul said, "Let me show you a better way, the most excellent way of love." Love is our only hope, guys. Loving our friends and relations, forgiveness, reconciliation. Also loving our enemies, by which I think Jesus meant don't objectify the other. Don't dehumanize people because you don't agree with them or because, in fact, their behavior is even disgusting. Don't dehumanize. That is the way of violence. Argue passionately against their repellent ideas and behaviors, but don't commit the violence of dehumanizing them, because that is actually a form of letting them off the hook. Now look, I have no truck with some of the despicable things Charlie Kirk spouted, who we've been hearing about in the news. But I do believe in free speech, and I do believe that violence never, ever solves anything. So my heart goes out to his wife and his kids and his loved ones, and I utterly refute the violence that killed him, not least because, as we've been thinking, violence has no part in a constructive future. Violence begets violence. So we can disagree and argue passionately, as we jolly well should, against things that we find harmful and despicable. But violence is never a way out, whether that's physical violence or verbal violence or emotional violence. That is not the way forward. That is always escalatory. So anyway, I've run out of steam really, and after a busy weekend, but I do hope that these thoughts bring some useful insight for you to chew over and think about. All very important stuff. And you know what? If you like what I'm doing here in the shed, guess what? You can support us. You can buy us a coffee. You just have to follow the link on the screen or in the information below your post. And once again, thank you so much to everyone who supports us in that way and other ways too. We need all of your support. And that's about it for this week. So I hope you have a good. I'll see you soon. You know, I mean, stay human. That's the thing, isn't it? Be kind to yourself and others, come what may. Here's to you. Have a good week. To life, l'chaim.